The morning Delilah Osei-Barnes walked into courtroom 14 of the Fulton County Superior Court. She was wearing her mother's pearl earrings and carrying a manila folder that weighed less than 2 pounds, but contained 23 years of her family's pain. Nobody looked at her twice. That was fine. She had counted on that. The bailiff by the door barely glanced up from his phone. The court reporter was sipping coffee and scrolling through something on her tablet. The attorneys at the prosecution table were whispering to each other about lunch, and at the center of it all, elevated on his bench like a man who had long ago confused his position with his worth, sat the Honorable Sterling Ashby, Chief Judge of the Fulton County Superior Court, 17-year veteran of the Georgia judiciary, member of 3 private clubs, recipient of the State Bar's Distinguished Service Award, and the man who, in October of 2001, had sent Delilah's father to prison for a crime he did not commit. Delilah took her seat in the gallery. She set the folder on her lap. She looked at Sterling Ashby's face. The silver hair combed back, the reading glasses perched at the end of his nose, the slight double chin that hadn't been there the last time she saw him, when she was 9 years old, and standing in the back of this very courtroom, watching him sentence her father to 30 years, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Nothing. Not rage, not grief. Not the electric, nauseating terror that had stalked her through law school and through 7 years as an assistant public defender, and through every sleepless night she'd spent reading her father's case files under a lamp in her apartment in Decatur. Just a clean, cold clarity. The kind that only comes after you have been preparing for something so long that the preparation itself has become who you are. She opened the folder on her lap and reviewed the first page one final time, even though she had memorized every word. Delilah's father was named Theodore Osei-Barnes. Everyone called him Theo. He was a 41-year-old electrician in 2001, a man who had built a small but solid life with his wife Camille and their 2 daughters in the East Point neighborhood south of Atlanta. He coached Little League in the summer. He sang in the choir at Greater Ebenezer Baptist. He had a weakness for peach cobbler and crossword puzzles, and arguing passionately about things that ultimately didn't matter. The best route from the airport. The proper way to season a cast-iron skillet, whether the Braves would ever build a roster that deserved their fans. He was not a man who had any obvious enemies, which made it all the more devastating when a woman named Rochelle Fanning told police that she had seen Theo's van parked outside the warehouse on the night that Damon Latterly was beaten and robbed of $40,000 in cash. Latterly was a local contractor with connections to people it was not wise to be connected to, and the robbery had apparently humiliated him badly enough that he wanted someone in a cage for it. Rochelle Fanning was white, 34 years old, and had recently been evicted from an apartment 3 blocks from the warehouse. She would later claim she had been walking her dog that night. Investigators never verified this. No one looked for the dog. Theo's attorney at the time was a man named Virgil Pratt, a sole practitioner who took 3 times as many cases as he could competently handle and billed his clients as if he handled twice that many again. He filed no pretrial motions challenging the eyewitness identification. He called no alibi witnesses, even though Theo had been at Ebenezer that night for a deacon's board meeting attended by 11 other people. He did not, as far as anyone could later determine, ever review the security footage from the gas station 1 block from the warehouse that showed Theo's van driving in the opposite direction of the crime at the time it allegedly occurred. Sterling Ashby, then a sitting Superior Court judge of 4 years, presided over the trial. He limited the defense's cross-examination of Rochelle Fanning to 45 minutes. He excluded a letter from one of Theo's colleagues that would have established his whereabouts. He sustained nearly every prosecution objection, and on the 3rd day of a trial that should have lasted at least 2 weeks, he instructed the jury in a manner that 3 subsequent legal scholars would describe in published law review articles as structurally biased toward conviction. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty. 30 years. Delilah was 9. Her sister Portia was 6. Their mother Camille stood in the gallery with her hands over her mouth, and the sound she made when they led Theo out was a sound Delilah had spent the last 23 years trying to unhear. The official story? The story that the Fulton County DA's office would put out if anyone asked, the story that Sterling Ashby had told himself so many times it had calcified into something he now genuinely believed, was that justice had been served. A fair trial. A unanimous verdict. Rule of law. The real story was considerably less tidy. Delilah found the first thread in 2019, 7 years into her career as a public defender, during a late night going through old case files for a seminar she was teaching on wrongful convictions. The file wasn't even Theo's. It was a case from 1999. A man named Alvin Greer, who had been convicted of aggravated assault under circumstances so similar to her father's, it stopped her breath. Same judge. Same prosecutor. Same exclusion of alibi evidence on technical grounds that appeared, on close reading, to be invented. Same eyewitness, in fact, Rochelle Fanning, who by 2019 had recanted her testimony in the Greer case and signed an affidavit stating that a man she knew only as Sterling's man had offered her $3,000 in cash and help with her eviction to say what she said. Delilah read the affidavit 4 times. Then she sat very still for a long time in her office with the lights off and the door closed. Then she started pulling files. It took her 4 years. 4 years of evenings and weekends, of filing public records requests under every name except her own, of driving to 3 different states to sit across from people who had never intended to tell the truth to anyone but who had, in the accumulated gravity of time and guilt and age, become tired of carrying what they knew. What she found was this: Sterling Ashby. He had, between 1998 and 2007, accepted cash payments totaling an estimated $240,000 from a network of individuals connected to a private bail bond company called Meridian Surety Group. In exchange, he had manipulated outcomes in at least 11 cases, excluding evidence, limiting cross-examination, providing jury instructions that tilted toward conviction. The men and women who went to prison in those cases were, without exception, black. The money that moved through Meridian Surety Group was, without exception, connected to the bail and property forfeiture ecosystem that profited directly from those convictions. Damon Latterly, the man Theo was accused of robbing, was a silent investor in Meridian Surety Group. Theo had not robbed anyone. He had been selected because he was there, and black, and his lawyer was incompetent, and Sterling Ashby had been paid to make sure the math worked out. Delilah sat with this knowledge for 6 months before she did anything. She needed it to be airtight. She needed corroboration that would survive every challenge, every motion to dismiss, every institutional pressure that would descend the moment she moved against a sitting chief judge. She knew what would happen to her professionally if she was wrong. She knew what would happen to her father if she was right, but insufficiently prepared. She was not going to be insufficiently prepared. She contacted a journalist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution named Quinton Marsh. She contacted a forensic accountant who had testified in federal corruption cases in Alabama and Mississippi. She contacted an attorney at the Georgia Innocence Project, whose name she had known for years but whom she had never called, because calling her would mean admitting out loud what she now knew was true. And she contacted the FBI field office in Atlanta, where a supervisory special agent named Carolee Drummond listened to her for 40 minutes without interrupting, and then said, very quietly, "Send me what you have." The hearing that morning was ostensibly a sentencing matter. A young man named Marcus Tillman, 22 years old, convicted of armed robbery 3 weeks prior. Delilah had reviewed his case file as well. The evidence against Tillman was thin in ways she recognized. Sterling Ashby had presided. She was not there for Marcus Tillman, though she had made sure his new attorney. A sharp young woman from the Georgia Innocence Project, named Sasha Forrest, was aware of everything Delilah had found and was prepared to use it on appeal. Delilah was there because Special Agent Drummond had told her 2 days ago to be there. Sterling Ashby called the courtroom to order at 9:15. He looked, from the gallery, like a man utterly at peace with himself, and perhaps he was. Perhaps that was what impunity did to a person over 17 years. Smoothed away all the jagged places where doubt might otherwise catch, left you with a surface so polished you could see your own reflection and mistake it for integrity. He called the case. He reviewed some preliminary matters. He looked over his glasses at the defense table, at Sasha Forrest, at Marcus Tillman in his ill-fitting jacket, and he asked if there were any statements before sentencing. Sasha Forrest stood. "Your Honor," she said, "before sentencing, I'd like to introduce new counsel to the court." Ashby frowned slightly. "New counsel? Miss Forrest, this is highly irregular at the sentencing stage." "I understand, Your Honor. But counsel has been retained specifically on the matter of a motion we'll be filing this morning. and she requested the opportunity to be present. Ashby looked at the clock. He looked at the prosecutor, a thin man named Harrington, whose expression had gone suddenly, carefully neutral. He looked back at Sasha Forrest. "Fine," he said. "Who is this new counsel?" Delilah Osei-Barnes stood up from the gallery and walked through the gate. She had thought about this moment many times. She had imagined Sterling Ashby's face going through various permutations: irritation, the polite blankness of a man who encountered strangers professionally several times a day. She had not known what she actually expected. What she had not expected was for him to recognize her. But he did. It was almost imperceptible. A fractional stiffening, a slight alteration in the way he was holding his jaw. But she had been studying Sterling Ashby's face in photographs and news footage for 4 years. And she saw it. He knew who she was. Which meant, she realized, that he had always known exactly what he had done to her father, that he had thought about it at some point, that somewhere in 17 years of distinguished service and awards and private club memberships, Theodore Osei-Barnes had existed in his memory as a fact he had simply decided to live with. Something moved through Delilah then that was not nothing. It was not the rage she had feared would make her sloppy. It was more like a door opening onto a very large and very cold room, and she stepped through it, and she was fine. "Delilah Osei-Barnes," she said, for the record, admitted to the Georgia Bar in 2012, currently serving as senior staff attorney with the Southern Justice Initiative. "I'm here on behalf of my client Marcus Tillman, Your Honor, and also in connection with a matter of some urgency to this court." "Osei-Barnes." Ashby's voice was controlled. It was the voice of a man who had been surprised before and had practiced not showing it. "Welcome. What is this matter of urgency?" "I wonder," she said, "if you remember me." A pause. In the gallery, something had shifted. The court reporter's fingers had stilled over her keys. The bailiff by the door was looking up from his phone. "I'm afraid I see a great many people in this courtroom," Ashby said. "I'm sure you do. I was 9 years old the last time I was in this room. I was standing back there." She turned briefly toward the gallery, then back. "My father was Theodore Osei-Barnes. You sentenced him to 30 years in October of 2001 for a robbery he didn't commit." The prosecutor, Harrington, was very still. "Miss Osei-Barnes," Ashby said, with a controlled patience that might have intimidated her once, "I'm going to caution you that this is a sentencing hearing, and whatever grievances you may have regarding a prior case, this is not the appropriate venue." "I have a motion, Your Honor." Delilah set the folder on the defense table and opened it. "I'm filing a motion for emergency stay of sentencing and for judicial recusal based on evidence of a pattern of corruption in this court going back to 1998. Harrington was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, this is completely improper. Counsel has no standing to." "She has standing," said a voice from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. 3 people had entered through the rear doors. 2 of them were in suits. The third was in a jacket with letters across the back that people in courtrooms had a complicated relationship with, but that always, without exception, got a room's full attention. Special Agent Carolee Drummond walked down the center aisle with the unhurried pace of a woman who had exactly as much authority as she needed and did not feel the necessity to perform it. Special Agent Carolee Drummond, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta Field Office. She produced credentials and held them up without particular ceremony. "Your Honor, I have a warrant for the seizure of financial records relating to this court, and I have a federal grand jury subpoena compelling your testimony in an ongoing investigation. I'd also like to note for the record that the motion Ms. Osei-Barnes has filed this morning is corroborated by evidence currently in federal custody." She paused. "She has standing." Sterling Ashby did not move. He was gripping the edge of his bench with both hands, and he looked in that moment exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 17 years believing he had gotten away with something, confronting the specific and terrible morning when he learned he had not. What happened next took a long time and no time at all. Ashby's attorney, a man named Beckford, who materialized from somewhere in the building within 20 minutes, with the smooth, well-pressed urgency of someone who had been on standby, immediately invoked his client's Fifth Amendment rights and requested that the hearing be suspended. Drummond's colleagues, 2 additional agents who had been waiting in the hallway, began the process of executing the warrant. Marcus Tillman's sentencing was continued pending the recusal motion. The courtroom, for the first time in perhaps its entire history, fell into a silence so complete that Delilah could hear the ventilation system humming somewhere above the drop ceiling. Then it filled with voices. Outside, in the corridor, in the atrium, in the parking structure, 3 floors below where someone had already gotten out their phone. Word was moving the way. Word always moved in courthouses, fast and multiplying, growing slightly more dramatic with each telling, until by the time it reached the coffee cart in the lobby, it had become a story about a judge being dragged out in handcuffs, which was not yet true, but which reflected a truth that everyone in that building understood with the particular clarity of people who had spent their careers watching the law work for some people considerably better than it worked for others. Delilah stood at the defense table and let it happen around her. Around Fatis, Sasha Forrest touched her arm gently. "You okay, yes?" Delilah said, and found that she meant it. She had not told her father. She had almost told him 4 times. Once when she found the Rochelle Fanning affidavit. Once when Quinton Marsh's first story ran in the Journal-Constitution. She had called him but lost her nerve and talked about something else for 20 minutes before hanging up. Once when Agent Drummond called to say the grand jury had been convened. Once the night before, when she sat in her car outside his apartment in College Park for 45 minutes and then drove home. She could not have explained to anyone who asked why she hadn't told him. She was not entirely sure herself. Part of it was that Delilah Osei-Barnes had spent 23 years managing his own expectations with a discipline that had become its own form of survival, and she could not bear to raise them and then watch him absorb the possibility of disappointment yet again. Part of it was that she needed it to be real first, needed to be standing in a room where it was actually happening. Before she could hand it to him as something he could keep, she drove to College Park at noon. Her father was in the kitchen when she let herself in with her key, standing at the stove making a pot of the pepper soup his mother had taught him, and that had become, in the absence of his mother and his freedom and his former life, one of the few things that remained entirely his own. He was 64 now. He had been released on compassionate grounds 6 years prior after a cardiac event, having served 17 of his 30 years. He walked with a slight lean to the left from an injury he'd sustained in his 2nd year of incarceration that had not been properly treated. He had aged in ways that were and were not about age. He turned around when she came in, and he looked at her face, and he set down the wooden spoon. "Dee," he said. It was what he had called her since she was small. "Daddy." She couldn't say anything else for a moment. She had prepared a careful sequence of explanations, the affidavit, the forensic accounting, the FBI, the hearing, and instead she stood in her father's kitchen doorway with her mother's pearl earrings in her ears and her throat closed entirely. Delilah Osei-Barnes crossed the kitchen and took his daughter's face in his hands, the way he had when she was 9 years old and crying in the car after they took him away, in the last moment before they separated them. And he had held on to her face, "Your mother and your sister, and I need you to know that I love you. And I need you to know that I did not do what they say." And she had believed him absolutely and had spent 23 years making that belief into something that could walk into courtroom 14 and stand up. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She told him everything: the Greer file, the Fanning affidavit, the money, Meridian Surety Group, Damon Latterly, Quinton Marsh's reporting, Agent Drummond, the warrant, the grand jury, what had happened this morning in front of Sterling Ashby. She talked for almost an hour. At some point, Theo sat down at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him the way they had sat across from each other through every prison visit for 17 years, and she kept talking until there was nothing left to say. When she stopped, the soup was still on the stove. The kitchen smelled like dried crayfish and Scotch bonnet, and the particular warmth of her father's apartment that she had associated, for as long as she had been coming here, with the complicated texture of surviving something that should not have happened to you. Theo was quiet for a long time. "The young man," he said finally. "The one whose hearing it was." She nodded. "His case is stayed. Sasha Forrest is filing for a new trial. Given what we found, his conviction almost certainly won't stand." "Good." He nodded slowly. "Good." He was quiet again. She waited. "You know what I kept thinking about," he said, "in there. Not every day, not toward the end so much, but in the early years, I kept thinking about the children, not just you and Portia, all of them. How many kids were going home from that courthouse and trying to explain to their mothers why their father wasn't coming? And I didn't know." He stopped, I didn't know if it was just me, or if it was something bigger, a machine of some kind. I didn't want it to be a machine, because if it was a machine, that meant no one had made a mistake. No one had made a mistake, and no one was going to fix it. Delilah looked at her father. "It was a machine," she said, "and someone is fixing it." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and the grip was still the same as it had always been. Firm, warm, absolute, and he held on the way he had held on to her face in the parking lot outside the courthouse in 2001, when she was 9 years old, and the world had broken in a way she did not yet have the language to describe. "I know," he said. Sterling Ashby was indicted on federal charges 6 weeks later. The indictment included 17 counts: bribery, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations under color of law. His attorney issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated. No one who knew the actual contents of the forensic accounting report found this statement persuasive. Quinton Marsh's series in the Journal-Constitution ran across 8 installments over 3 months and was later adapted into a documentary. The second installment, which focused specifically on Theo's case, ran under the headline, "A Father, a Frame, and 17 Years." Theo read it at his kitchen table, the morning it published, with a cup of coffee and his reading glasses and no one else present, which was how he had chosen to receive it, and which Delilah respected, without needing to understand it. Marcus Tillman's conviction was vacated by order of a new judge 4 months after the hearing. He was 22 years old and had served 8 months. Sasha Forrest was present. Delilah was present. Marcus Tillman's mother was present, and when the order was read, she made a sound not entirely unlike the sound Delilah Osei-Barnes had made in a different courtroom 23 years ago, but reversed, and moving in the other direction, from grief into something that didn't have a clean name, but that everyone in that room recognized immediately. The Georgia Supreme Court launched an independent review of all cases over which Sterling Ashby had presided. Of the 11 cases Delilah had identified in her initial research, 9 were flagged for further examination. Of those 9, 7 ultimately resulted in either overturned convictions or reduced sentences. The other 2 were more complicated. One of the individuals had died in custody. The other had been released but had not survived the first year of his freedom, in ways that were not connected to what incarceration had done to his body. Delilah kept those 2 files in a separate folder. She did not know what to do with them, yet she suspected that she would be figuring out what to do with them for the rest of her career. The thing about justice, the real kind, not the kind that gets inscribed on courthouse walls, is that it doesn't arrive the way you think it will. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like closure. It feels like a very long breath that you've been holding for so long you forgot it was a breath, and when you finally let it out, you realize your whole body had been organizing itself around the holding of it, and now it has to learn some other way to be. Delilah thought about this on a Sunday afternoon in February, sitting on the back porch of her father's apartment in College Park with a cup of tea and the particular quiet of a winter afternoon in Georgia. The gray sky, the bare trees, the distant sound of a lawnmower in the cold. She thought about a 9-year-old girl standing in the back of courtroom 14, watching the world end in a way nobody would acknowledge as an ending. She thought about 17 years of visits and letters and pretrial motions that went nowhere, and appeals that went nowhere, and a mother who had worked 2 jobs and kept everything together with a consistency that should have entitled her to something better than what the world had offered her. She thought about Sterling Ashby, sitting somewhere with his attorney and his Fifth Amendment rights and whatever internal architecture a person builds in order to live with what he had done. She did not feel sorry for him. She did not feel the need to. She did think about the comment that someone had left under Quinton Marsh's first article. Not the comment with the most likes, not the most eloquent one, but a short one from a woman who identified herself as a grandmother in Birmingham, who wrote simply, "My son has been in there for 12 years, and I have been praying for something like this to happen to someone. Not revenge. Just the truth to finally cost something." Delilah had read that comment sitting in her car in the Journal-Constitution parking lot after talking to Quinton Marsh for 2 hours, and she had sat with it for a long time before she drove away. The truth to finally cost something. She took a sip of her tea. Her father's kitchen light was on behind her. She could hear him in there moving around, opening a cabinet, setting something on the counter. The ordinary sounds of a man living an ordinary afternoon. The sounds she had spent 23 years wanting to hear from somewhere other than a prison phone line. The door opened behind her. "Soup's ready," Theo said. Delilah Osei-Barnes set down her tea and went inside.